Yeah, and we are live everywhere, I believe. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Nina. Well, good morning for you. How are you
Good
doing?
morning for me. I was doing pretty well until you know what happened. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another fun filled installment of the Winter Latina show where we talk about death and destruction. And today I am a true Winter Latina because I'm pretty pissed off. Let me show you what happened. What is this, Marcelo? What is it?
It looks like a nice microphone.
It kind of looks a little bit like your microphone.
It is the same brand.
It's the same brand. Can you guess what happened with this microphone, Marcelo? Well, Marcelo, I am using a MacBook. And when I purchased this microphone, I specifically checked whether this microphone is going to be compatible with a MacBook. And it said yes. And I have the box right in front of me. And I've been extremely busy when it came in, so I haven't actually tested it out until now, because as the saying goes, first things first, second things second, third things possibly never. And this was my first thing this morning after I got off work, only to find out that it's the wrong USB. And I tried to see if I have an adapter, and to no avail. So guys, you're gonna be stuck with me with my cheapo microphone and little earphones for now. What's shocking to me is that my other cheap headphones with a mic that make me look like a call center operator do plug into my computer. This more expensive microphone does not. Can someone explain that to me? Probably not. So we are in possession of the coveted microphone. Again, it's not the best one on the market, but it's pretty good. I think Marcelo's is pretty good. But eventually, we're going to get an adapter and actually be able to plug it into this Apple product. But without going on a rant about Apple products and their compatibility with other products, because Marcelo and I have been on this rant for a while before we launched this episode, which is why we're late. We're so sorry. We're going to jump into our story. And today, Marcelo probably has no idea what we're talking about.
As
I think
usually,
the last time Marcelo cheated a little bit, he Googled the name. He kind of had a little bit of an idea. But this time, he could not be so sneaky because he doesn't have a name. He has no idea what we're talking about. So I think his reactions, if he chooses to react with me blabbing on and on, are going to be completely, genuine first-hand access, right? First-hand impressions. So go ahead.
Yeah, just to remember everybody to like, share, subscribe if you like the show. And if you like to send us some super chat and subscribe to the channels, will help to get the adapter. JFB just suggested an adapter. Yes, of course. Just remember to send some super chats. And Who Cares said that he thought the dog had chewed the brand new mics. So
that would be a good excuse.
Okay.
The dog ate my homework. That would be a good excuse. The dog chewed well, actually, one of my puppies, I literally have to, like all my plugs that I have out, I have to unplug them and put them to higher ground to ensure that she's not going to chew them, although she's sort of losing interest, which is a good sign. But I've gone through, I think this is my fourth pair of flip-flops that she has decided to eat. So yes, this would have been a very legitimate excuse had I wanted to lie. But yeah, it's basically the incompatibility between the Apple product versus this product, despite the label on the box of it being compatible with a MacBook. So here we are. So Marcelo, you are completely unaware of what we're talking about. Today's story is not going to be too long. We don't want to hold you guys here for too long. It's very hot. We're sitting in front of hot lights. We have fans going. You probably hear them. You probably want to be out enjoying the sun instead of listening to the pissed off Winter Latina blabbing on. So without further ado, as I'm calming down, trying to make myself slightly less pissed off, yoga breaths. Yeah, I know. Yoga. I've never done yoga. I don't really know what that's like. But here we are. So Marcelo, here is a man. He was on a very important business trip. The trip was successful. He almost completed the project that he was working on. He obtained all the information that was necessary for this project. and he was on his way back to deliver the project details, the results to his higher-ups. It was early September. The weather was still pretty nice in the daytime. It's actually my favorite time. I think September is my favorite time of the year because it's cooler in the daytime. It still feels like summer, but of course nights are getting cooler. He wasn't too far away from the ocean, so there was that effect on the weather in terms of coolness, especially at night. He had a pretty long journey. He was traveling through the forest, through the meadows, and he was about to get back to deliver the results of his project. He was pretty pleased with himself. He obtained exactly what he was looking for, and he was very successful at his job. And one of the things he had to do for his job, in addition to obtaining and sorting and organizing various types of information, was pretending to be other people. He wasn't really sure why he was so good at his job. Perhaps it was his love of theater that, as long as he could remember, he's always liked theater. He's always liked going to the theater. And sometimes he could imitate other people so well that they would forget that he was imitating a person of another ethnocultural or even racial background. Perhaps it was the fact that he was using the appropriate gestures. Perhaps it was the fact that he was using the appropriate gait when he walked. Perhaps it was his clothing. Perhaps it was everything in totality that made him really believable, that people forgot that he was not a person who he was, but he was in fact someone else, including people from, again, completely different backgrounds. So he was pretty pleased with himself. He was very happy that he managed to get the information that he was looking for, and he was about to get back. But he didn't. As he was heading back, he ran into an important man, a higher up, who was riding a horse, and this man ordered him to give some water to his horse. He's been riding for a while. The higher up was thirsty, the horse was thirsty, but there was a problem. He didn't really quite understand the language. He was very good at theater. He was really good at pretending to be someone else, but he didn't actually fully learn the language. So from then on, it's a little bit murky. Either he misunderstood what was being asked of him completely, he did not understand the language, or he did not carry out the order exactly as it was, said to him. Be that as it may, the man with a horse, this important man, got really pissed off to the point where he attacked him. He started beating him, and he pulled so hard on his hair that his hair came off his head. Because it wasn't his hair, it was a wig. He had a pretty believable wig with a long braid. So this man with a horse pulled on the braid, and the wig was gone. And from then on, everything unraveled very, very quickly. The man and his allies, whom he worked with, ended up interrogating him, getting all the information about his project, the type of information that he gathered, how he sorted this information, how he got it, where he was taking it. Basically, everything that he was really proud of was now falling apart. And by the end of the interrogation, the people who captured him decided that there was only one thing to do, and that was to kill him. He had to be killed. And as it happens in such situations, his life flashed before his eyes. He remembered growing up in a little village. He remembered amazing summers where he would go into the woods and play with his friends. He remembered his family, of course, his parents. He also remembered his wife. He was only 33 years old. His children were just growing up. He felt a little bit of shame because he wasn't always very nice to his wife. He really, really, truly loved her, but sometimes he would drink a little too much and he would get physical. And of course, at the time that we are talking about in the early 20th century, such behavior was more accepted. But he felt some shame about not always treating his wife right. He missed his children, he missed her, he missed his little village, he missed going to the theater before he volunteered to be in the army, before he volunteered to be a scout. A scout that would go behind enemy lines and gather information on reconnaissance missions. And everything then stopped because he was shot. He was shot with a single rifle shot. And up until that point, no one really knew about his existence. He was just an ordinary scout. He was a regular soldier. I mean, beyond his family, his friends, and perhaps his comrades in the army, no one knew about him, but that was about to change. He was about to become very, very famous, to the point where now, 119 years later, he is still remembered. What do you think, Marcelo?
So far, not a clue.
Not a clue.
So far, not a clue.
So you could probably tell a little bit by the title of this episode, by the cover image.
Not even that.
Not even that. Well, what does it make you think of? Our title is The Death of the Russian Samurai, and we just had a man shot to death, executed, and it happened 119 years ago. We're in 2024. So what year would that be, Marcelo? Let's do some math. I know it's not morning. I think your brain should be working.
Should be working, yes. So it's 1905. So
it's 1905. It's September 1905. This man was just executed. He was executed because he was captured as a spy. He was captured coming back from a very successful reconnaissance mission with all his information. And what do you think?
Not good at dates.
Not a clue. Well, at least your mouth is good. I'm impressed.
That should be my strong point.
It should be your strong point. We should just do numbers and then.
Yeah, exactly. We start doing numbers that would work better.
We should do numbers that should work better. Well,
plus history is also not my strong. So I'm kind of lost here. Who the guy? I thought about a lot of people, but it's just shameful to say those names. This is not a famous person to the point it's it's a general that everyone would know. So I don't think you need to be ashamed by not knowing. But the fact that this is someone who was, again, just a completely regular soldier, beyond his social circle and his comrades in the army, no one really knew about his existence. And all of a sudden, he becomes very, very famous. His name was Vasily Ryabov. He was born in a small village, like I said, outside of Penza. Penza is a few hundred kilometers outside of Moscow. He was born in 1871. He did love theater. He did have a family. He did have a wife. He was not always the best husband. Like I said, there was a little bit of drinking involved. There was the fact that when he would occasionally drink, he would hit his wife. So again, in the early 20th century, that was probably more accepted than it is today. So he was definitely not a perfect hero. But the reason he got famous is a note. There was a note. There was an oak tree not too far away from where he was shot to death, where he was executed, and there was a note left on the oak tree. And the note was actually in multiple languages. There was another note in Mandarin Chinese telling not to touch the original note. And this is the original note. I'm going to read it in full. This is my translation. And here goes the quote. A reserve soldier, Vasily Ryabov, 33 years old, from the hunting, as in scout, team of the 284th Chimbarsky Infantry Regiment, born in the province of Penza, dressed as a Chinese peasant, was captured on September 17th, 1904, on the front lines by our soldiers. According to his oral testimony, it became clear that he was sent to us on a reconnaissance mission to discover the location
and actions of our army upon his own wish, and made his way toward our troops through Yantai on September 14, following the southeastern direction. After reviewing the case in proper order, Ryabov was sentenced to death. The latter was carried out on September 17th with a rifle shot. In bringing this event to the attention of the Russian army, our army cannot but express our sincere wishes to your respected army so that it rears more of such wonderful soldiers like the aforementioned Ryabov, who is worthy of complete respect. Our sympathy for this truly brave man, overwhelmed by his sense of duty and an exemplary soldier, reaches the utmost limit. Respectfully signed, Staff Captain of the Japanese Army. That is the main note, sitting attached to a lonely oak tree in the middle of nowhere in the far east of Eurasia in Manchuria. And like I said, the second note was in Chinese, alerting the locals, the local Chinese population who live there, to not touch the note and destroy the main note. And the note also gave instructions and directions how to obtain the body of this absolutely regular soldier where he was shot and bring them back to the Russian troops. What do you think about this now?
Yeah, so now I have a lot of context and a lot of things to think about. So first thing that comes to my mind is a legend. I'm not sure how historically accurate is this about the Drei Brazilian Herren, which is in German for three Brazilian heroes. And this is a legend that is very. It actually became a music. I think I once sent it to you from that Swedish band. That
Yes.
was an okay band, and now is a super propagandist Pussy Riot style.
I know. A band that should not be mentioned. Band that used to do kind of fun World War II happy metal songs, but
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this is what happens when you live in Sweden. So
this is what happens when you guys don't send us super chat. We got sold out. Of course, I'm kidding, guys. This is my thing. It's better. I'm even better in this than in math.
So what is the?
So this legend or history is about three Brazilian soldiers that fought on northern Italy during World War II. That they were cut off from the rest of the army, and in between the line of contact between the Germans and the Brazilian army that was pushing them up in the hills of Italy, and they made such a mess to the German army that they end up being killed by the German army. But the German general was so impressed by their performance that told the army to bury them with honors and all respect possible, and become the legend of the three Brazilian heroes. First comes to my mind, the amazingness of this person, and the second thing is the respect from the enemy.
From the enemy, exactly.
To the amazingness of this person.
Well, right. So there is some kind of, two things, right? There is some kind of humanity, even though they were, it's obviously not surprising that someone gathering information, right, acting as a spy, gathering, being on a reconnaissance mission would be executed. I mean, it's completely unsurprising. But here we're talking, I think it's probably even more impressive in World War II, but here we're talking about the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, 1905, so 119 to 120 years ago. And the total the total casualties for both sides, again, it's a little bit difficult to estimate, were about 500,000 people. Pretty equal on each side. Fewer Russians died than Japanese. Again, according to some estimates, I think the Japanese lost somewhere upward of 80,000 people, as in killed in action, and the Russian side lost around 60,000. So the rest were lost in other ways, wounded, et cetera, et cetera. So it's obviously, that's a pretty big number for the first major conflict of the 20th century. But when you look at those numbers, the fact that this man, who is, again, a completely ordinary soldier, he was in the infantry, he was from a village, from the countryside, he was gathering information, the fact that he would be singled out like this, and the Russian side would not have known what had happened to him had it not been for this note coming from the enemy, and such a respectful note. I think it really does put things into perspective, that they really were deeply impressed by his behavior, by his bravery. I am only assuming, I don't know how much more information there is about this man, that he must have been interrogated. Perhaps he didn't give up certain types of information when he was interrogated beyond what he had on him. So that was probably impressive to them too. But I also think it is this kind of behavior that also instilled the image of chivalry for the Japanese army, which was then broken with World War II in light of the atrocities committed by certain members of that army. I think cases like this is what really solidified it, because this is something that was popularized, this particular case in the Russian language. And the Japanese army was so impressed by Ryabov that they referred to him as the Russian samurai, again, apparently referring to that particular spirit, this warrior spirit, but also having the dignity to die in the way that he did, sort of still faithful to his people, to God, to his army, to his motherland, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact that they not only left this note, but also told the Russian side where to find his body, to retrieve it, and told the Chinese locals not to touch the body, I think is really kind of interesting, and it's sort of a microcosm of the overall situation. So I think we should take a few minutes to talk about the Russo-Japanese War, which for Russia was pretty disastrous, the first major conflict of the 20th century. What do you know about this conflict? I know you just said you're not much of a history person, but you probably...
Exactly. Yeah, no, because it's a conflict that in Latin America, in South America at least, is not even touched upon in normal school history books, that we not even mentioned, I would say. So the one things that I heard about, and I don't know how accurate they are, is that Russia lost this war, and there is always this gray zone between they lost the war or they accomplished what was intended by the war. So that's a curiosity I had while we were talking about this. I was thinking, perhaps it's a good moment to ask something like that.
It is a good moment to ask something like that. Well, Marcelo, let me give you a summary of a complicated conflict. That's a mouthful. But you basically remember Japan. The first European conflict in the early modern period actually came from your people, Marcelo, from the Portuguese in the middle of the 16th century. But so there was that interaction with the Europeans. Of course, the Japanese had contacts with sort of closer people in East Asia. But after that, Japan was essentially, according to the official historiography, was a closed country up until the middle of the 19th century. And the people that opened up Japan to the world, kicking and screaming, Japan didn't really want to open up, was the Americans. Is that really a surprise? Well, it may be a little bit surprising that it happened earlier than the true rise of America a century later to become a superpower. But it was Matthew Perry, a Navy commander, who traveled to Japan, and he essentially engaged in gunboat diplomacy in the middle of the 19th century. He essentially forced the Japanese, you're arriving to this country with big ships with big weapons on them. He essentially forced Japan to open up, to sign an agreement, and from then on, for better or for worse, Japan started to develop technologically. It had more interactions with European powers. And by the end of the 19th century, Japan was doing very well in that particular regard. Now, of course, Japan had poor people, that some of whom ended up immigrating to the US. For instance, they went to Hawaii. But
to Brazil a lot.
Pardon? Yes, to Brazil as well. I mean, I know Brazil still has this population, and some Japanese Brazilians then go back, maybe a couple generations later, go back to Japan to work. I know there are a couple of places that have a sizable population of these Japanese Brazilians. Yeah, and so Japan was basically an expansionist power by the end of the 19th century. And then we have to put into context China, that was undergoing its century of humiliation, as it calls it, with Britain pretty much ruling the region and forcing, having the Opium Wars, forcing China into agreements that I don't think China really wanted to be a part of. And so China is pretty weak at this time, so late 19th, early 20th century, and Japan takes advantage of that. So Japan is, of course, it didn't really become a true expansionist power until the 20th century with its militarism, sort of the 20s, especially the 30s, heading into World War II. But it started taking advantage of another country in the region, Korea, right, at the same time as well. So that in the early 20th century, Japan was essentially in control of Korea. Now, what is the problem with the Japanese empire expanding in this direction? Well, the fact that Russia is also expanding in this direction, right? So you kind of had this late imperial clash between the two powers that were trying to sort out their regional ambitions, cooperation, or lack thereof, in what would be the Russian Far East. And obviously not really asking China much as to whether it wanted to be involved in this, or Korea for that matter, in this imperial clash in the other side of Eurasia. And I don't really think the Russians wanted war, but they were not signing some of the agreements that they thought were detrimental that were coming from the Japanese side. And Japan was supported both by Britain and the US. Is it really surprising? Does Britain ever keep its nose out of anything? Maybe less so.
Are we
these
talking
days?
about Boris Johnson now?
Boris Johnson of the early 20th century. Yeah, so Japan was supported by Britain and the US, maybe not to a huge extent, but there was that backing because if you remember, the traditional British foreign policy was not to allow the rise of a major power in continental Europe. We can include Russia in that, even though Russia covers more than just Europe. And so Britain traditionally would engage in kind of pitting powers against each other. We talked about Britain versus Germany in the 19th century a little bit, how by sort of focusing on Russia, Britain missed the development of Germany. And that became a problem for Britain in the early 20th century. But yeah, so this was basically the sort of the lay of the land in the early 20th century. And very abruptly at one point, Japan ended up severing any kind of diplomatic relations with Russia. And the very same day, Japanese troops, without declaring war, which is surprising for this time period. Usually things had to be very official. They ended up attacking Russian ships in February of 1904. So this was sort of the official start of the war, even though the war was not declared. And for Russia specifically, Russia had Vladivostok, which is it still is a major port city, but it's a city in the north. And so that city is not, or at the time was not open year round, right? In terms of accessibility, it would freeze. So Russia was interested in having more access to the other side of the continent and having a port that would be more accessible or all year round, such as place that was back then known as Port Arthur. Of course, today it has a Chinese name, which I'm going to butcher. I don't know if it's Lushun or Lushun, but that's what it's called today. And you could still look up this location with its old British name. Again, ask yourself a question: why does it have a British name in China? As Japan and Russia are sort of butting heads over it, I think that's very, very, very telling in terms of the imperial competition in that particular region, to the detriment of some countries and people, for sure. And so this war goes on up until not too long, but the death toll is quite high, right, for that time period. It goes on for about a year and a half, right, 1904, 1905. And this war was devastating to Russia because it exacerbated the internal contradictions that we talked about previously. There was a lot of discontent, especially in cities, with the emergent working class. And there was the failed revolution of 1905. And we discussed this briefly on this channel. But basically, the way that this war was going in the Far East really informed that protest that ended up being called the failed revolution of 1905. So the general population was not very happy with Nicholas II's policies within this war. And Russia ultimately ended up losing some land. So for instance, it lost half, the southern half of Sakhalin to Japan at this time. And it was forced to acknowledge that Japan was in control of Korea. I don't think Koreans were asked as to whether they wanted Japan or anyone else to be in charge, so to speak. But basically, this is what happened. So the particular case that we're talking about, since it happened in 1904, I am going to butcher this name too, but it was called, because all of these are Chinese names and I don't speak Chinese. I know it's shocking. This is the one language, the one language that I don't know, but it was the Battle of Liaoyang. And so after that battle, officially it's considered a major battle with a pretty big death toll for both sides. Officially, Japan is considered to have won this battle, even though the Russian troops withdrew. But after that, the Russian side needed desperately more information about the location, the positioning, the equipment, et cetera, of the Japanese troops, which is why someone like this absolutely regular soldier, Mr. Ryabov, went in to gather this information. So this is the general context. And who ended this war, who brokered the peace agreement that was very beneficial to Japan and detrimental to Russia? Well, it was the American president, Teddy Roosevelt. He really inserted himself into the agreement. It was the Treaty of Portsmouth. And from then on, because Japan did so well in this war, I don't think the Western European powers expected it to do so well, even though they were sort of backing Japan against Russia. They considered Japan to be one of theirs, right? An imperial power in Asia. Almost, I think some texts almost refer to it as the white man of Asia, using the language from the past, where the Japanese were so badass, so imperialist, that they were just like the Europeans. So I think that's also very telling. So this is the general context of what we're talking about. So what do you think happened to Ryabov after this? I mean, he's obviously dead, and there is a note.
Well, yeah, since I would imagine, since we know the content of the note and there was indications where to find the body, I would imagine that the body was recovered, went back home, and was buried with honors, whatever, in Russia or something like that.
Right.
Am I mistaken?
You're not mistaken. So the body was indeed recovered thanks to the note. It was recovered by a regiment of Cossacks, the Orenburg Cossacks. They found him. They brought him back. He was indeed transported back home, so across the entire continent. And the story was so famous initially through the word of mouth, but it sort of rose up the ranks as well, that Tsar himself learned about the story. He was really touched by the story. And, my sentiment about Nicholas is very
controversial.
It's not controversial. I would say well, because we just passed the anniversary of his execution by the new, the new Bolshevik government, and there's a lot of discussion about this topic, and a lot of times I disagree with the discussion. I didn't participate this year because I was too busy, but basically you can sort of feel empathy for a man and especially his family, especially his children, but you can also consider him to be a very poor, unfit, disconnected ruler. You can maybe separate those two. So that's my sentiment about Nicholas. So, Nicholas sort of persisted with this war that was not going well. He missed opportunity to sign agreements with Japan. That was clearly an expansionist power that was doing very well in that region. And so nonetheless, be that as it may, he ended up attaining a lot of publicity. Well, of course, he is the Tsar, so it's probably not that difficult. But yeah, he ended up raising awareness, as kids like to say these days, to the case of Ryabov and the way he died, and that he died a hero to the point that even the enemies were very impressed by his conduct right before he was executed. And there was a lot of fundraising all across the country. A part of the money that was raised went to his family because, of course, his widow and his children were in a difficult situation once, the head of the household was killed. And they raised a lot of money for the kids to be not only taken care of, but also go to good schools. They also raised money to open a school in one of the villages where he lived as he was growing up. He moved to a different village when he volunteered. Well, first he was in reserve, and then he volunteered to be in the army. So basically, they built and opened a school and named it after him in sort of his old stomping grounds. When his body finally came back to the European side of Russia for proper burial with military honors, as you said, people from all over met his body with icons, with flowers, so he was almost venerated. So you can kind of imagine the level of publicity that he was getting after his death. I don't think that's something he would have ever imagined as some random regular guy from a village who happened to love theater, and possibly this is why he was able to pretend so well to be a Chinese peasant, even though he was not Chinese. And so I think the most sort of interesting part of what happened after his death is that, Moscow has the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, sort of the big church with golden domes that whenever you see photographs of Moscow, you see these days, right? It's not too far away from the Kremlin. It's very imposing. But this is the second cathedral, right? The initial cathedral was destroyed by the early Soviet government. And for many decades, there was a swimming pool, an outdoor swimming pool in the place of the cathedral. As someone who grew up in Moscow, as much as I don't think churches should be destroyed, I had a nostalgic attachment of walking past the swimming pool as I headed to my art classes, for instance, and then I transferred schools and I went to a different school where I walked past that location too. So to me, I'll always remember the swimming pool, although I'm very happy that they rebuilt the church. But back in the day, this church was sort of one of the main military cathedrals of the Russian armed forces. And because it's the main cathedral, it venerates very important generals, or back in the day, it venerated very important people in the army. But there was one slab for the regular soldier, and it only had 17 names. So if you imagine how many people died in wars over centuries, it's a pretty big list. Well, Ryabov was one of the 17 names on the slab. I assume when the church was blown up, everything was destroyed, but there is a record that he was one of the names. So he sort of ended up going down in history as this amazing, brave man, even though he, again, I think by all accounts, up until that act of heroism, essentially on his proverbial deathbed, or I'm assuming he was shot maybe next to a tree, he was really just, an average guy. So I think it's a very interesting contrast between his life, which was by no means perfect. Like I said, he wasn't very nice to his wife sometimes. He would occasionally drink too much, especially when he went to the theater to see some plays, some local plays. Very, very different contrast to what became of him after he died, and in part thanks to his enemies. So the thing that kind of makes me chuckle a little bit to kind of lighten the mood here is that there are a lot of these TikToks or the Chinese version of TikTok videos of these borderland Russians that either still live in Russia or they moved to China. They're married to Chinese women. And whenever I see that, I think of Ryabov because, I mean, he did not live there, but you watch these videos and these people look very Slavic, but everything else about them is like so Chinese. They're speaking Chinese, they have Chinese families. I mean, I'm assuming they're speaking well, proficiently, maybe without an accent, but everything else about their mannerisms, they really fit into, because this is not a city, right? These are kind of more, from what I understand, rural environments. So whenever I see some of these people that are sort of big on that social media, it makes me think of this man, how he, being a Slav, was able to pretend to be a Chinese peasant. Yes, he was wearing a wig, but I'm thinking like his facial features probably, he's not from that part of Russia where he would have looked more Asian. And so the fact that he was able to imitate the locals so well that either the locals, I mean, perhaps they pretended, they didn't notice him, but the Japanese army did not notice him either until that incident with an officer demanding that his horse get some water, getting really mad and pulling off his wig. So again, this was a fluke that he got caught. So yeah, this is the end of the story of Mr. Ryabov.
Can you say it again? Miss
Ryabov. I'm rolling the R. You don't have to roll the R. It's actually so funny because I try to pronounce, I'm not very consistent. I try to sometimes pronounce names and cities in the original language, and there's a debate of whether you should say them more in the North American accent or you should pronounce them more in the original way. I guess when it comes to Russian names, if it's not a famous name, like maybe I'll say Putin, but if it's a name that's not a famous name, I would say it with the original accent. But I remember some activist from the blue and yellow flag country was accusing me of having a thick Russian accent because I think she herself did not understand that I was speaking with a North American accent, but I was reading the names with a Russian accent because they were Russian names. But yeah, you can say Ryabov if you want, or you can say Ryabov and roll the R. I think you can roll the R, Marcelo, because your language has something.
Yes, something like that.
There we go. So that's the story of an ordinary soldier who became famous to the point where he was immortalized in the biggest military cathedral, the earlier version of the old Russian Empire, because he impressed the enemy. It's kind of sort of the series of events that have to happen for this to happen are a little bit crazy.
Yeah, I miss the old days where armies respected the others.
I think there are still some cases of valor. There's still some cases of respect. Unfortunately, they're overshadowed by other cases where the opposite is true. And I think this was my point about the Japanese army, that it was known to have this code of honor, this idealized samurai, the fact that they were calling this the Russian enemy, the Russian samurai, and then kind of having a little bit of a different behavior, to say the least, during World War II. Obviously not every single soldier, but some, the atrocities that were documented, very different.
That was the thing that came to my mind at some point that I missed. That was, when we learn via Hollywood, about Japanese wars, and we always learn this, this honor, this, a way of the samurai, being defeat and accepting defeat and all that. And it just looks like Japan at that moment, at some moment over there, after that perhaps, became this imperialist monster, Western imperialist monster that was not Japan before. let's
And
hope
again, I
they
think it
come
pertains
to
to,
senses.
yeah, it's the question of, it definitely pertains to specific people, specific officers that oversaw,
Sure.
the atrocities in World War II. But obviously, there's also the case of personal responsibility. If you go and read books on the subject, the people who were engaging in the atrocities were also not treating their underlings well either. So it went both ways. Not to say that that's not an excuse, but I think it says a lot about the personalities of the people and the stresses that they were under that possibly activated this psychopathic behavior to a much greater extent, where they would, regularly beat their own soldiers, for instance, in addition to engaging in the documented atrocities. But yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting contrast. And this particular conflict, because it's an imperial conflict between these two powers, right, fought sort of where a weaker China and a weaker Korea didn't really have much say about their own about their own lands, about their own self-determination. I think it's also kind of a sort of one of the last conflicts of, I would say, even though it's in the 20th century, it's kind of like a 19th century conflict, even though, yes, it was using more modern technology and it helped develop technology going into World War I. In my mind, it's still kind of like an old school conflict with, again, more of the sense of valor and honor, and again, empires fighting in kind of a more traditional way over land. And then, of course, World War I was this major watershed moment that sort of brought civilization in its worst expression, right, to the forefront, and brought us into the truly, high modern period as well. So there we are. This is a shorter episode, so I can get some rest.
We are 45 minutes. It's not that short.
It's not that short. It's me blabbing about my microphone in the beginning that made it longer. And I'm telling you, Marcelo, I'm just going to open a random drawer and I'm going to have a random plug pop up, and I'm going to realize, oh, I could have used that because I've had it from before and I forgot about its existence, and I could have just plugged in. This is what's going to happen.
I'm sure.
And then I'll be motivated to be...
15 minutes, they found it.
I found it. Yeah, I know. And then I'll be, well, it was not part of the box. That's the problem. It should have been something like that. If you're marketing it for a Mac, you should include it in your product as an adapter for a Mac, or not market it for a Mac. Pretty obvious. But yes, so then I'll have enough energy. My point is to be an angry winter Latina for the next episode, which is, I think, what we want for me to live up more to being a winter Latina, right? Emphasis on Latina, very gestury, emotional, etc. So I'm sure Latinas want to kick my ass after that, but here we are.
No, this is you have a Latino on this show, so we have what's it called? Place of speak.
I'm allowed to make sketchy comments about the Latin American population. Very good. Thank you Thank you for making that allowance.
So yeah, I think we arrived to the end of it today. I would like to remember everybody to like, share, subscribe to the channels, both of channels. If you like Nina, come to visit the Press of Mass Destruction, or Imprensa de Destruição em Massa.
Because we have more interviews for you guys. As you see, we've been interspersing one type of content with another type of content. And so hopefully in August and in the next few weeks, we'll have some more interesting conversations with interesting people.
For sure. And if you are in the Press of Mass Destruction, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nina's. It's at Nina Bizantina. You can see down here. At Nina Bizantina, everywhere, YouTube, Rumble, Twitter X, in my case also Telegram, Odyssey, Instagram, and now TikTok, temporarily banned because I showed some weapon images, so I'm shadow banned for a week.
Of all the places, right? You'd expect Facebook or something, or Instagram to ban you, but no, it's TikTok.
TikTok. Shadow ban for a week. It's all right. I learned the rule. So yeah, I guess I'll see you next time, Nina.
Thank you, guys. We'll see you soon. Thank you for watching. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.